In the autumn of 1945, the quiet farming community of Millbrook, Kansas, was unsettled by the mysterious disappearance of the Peterson family. They had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a dinner table still set for five. But 12 years later, when Janet Peterson stumbles upon a hidden cellar beneath the old farmhouse, she uncovers a truth so horrifying it would unravel the very fabric of her understanding and lead to the most chilling revelation imaginable. The morning of October the 15th dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of golden light that made the wheat fields shimmer like an ocean of brass. Thomas Milbury had risen before sunrise, as farmers do, to tend to his livestock. The air carried the sweet scent of harvested grain and the earthy promise of winter's approach. But as Thomas walked the fence line separating his property from the Peterson farm, something felt wrong. The Peterson house sat silent in the distance, its windows dark despite the late morning hour. No smoke rose from the chimney. The barn doors hung open, and Thomas could see the family's two horses still in their stalls, shifting restlessly. Most troubling of all, the wheat in the south field remained unharvested golden stalks, bent heavy with grain that should have been gathered weeks ago. Thomas had known Frank Peterson for 15 years. The man was methodical to a fault, rising each day at 4:30 sharp, finishing his coffee by 5 and working until the last possible moment of daylight. Frank would never leave his harvest to waste in the field. Never. The silence pressed against Thomas's ears as he climbed the porch steps. The wooden boards creaked under his weight, a sound that seemed too loud in the stillness. He knocked 3 times, waited, then knocked again. No answer came. Through the front window, he could see into the dining room where 5 place settings waited on the oak table. A loaf of bread sat half-sliced beside a butter dish. A pot of coffee remained on the stove, its contents long since cold. Thomas tried the door handle. It turned easily in his grip. The years between 1945 and 1957 passed like a slow healing wound for the residents of Millbrook. The Peterson case remained officially open, though the Sheriff's Department had long since stopped actively investigating. Life moved forward as it must, but the empty farmhouse served as a constant reminder of questions that refused to die. Janet Peterson had been 23 when her cousins disappeared, living in Chicago and building a career as a schoolteacher. The telegram informing her of the inheritance arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a boy who couldn't have been more than 14. The Peterson property, all 200 acres, the house and everything in it, now belonged to her. She arrived in Millbrook on the first warm day of spring, driving a powder blue Ford that looked foreign against the backdrop of rusted pickup trucks and farm equipment. The townspeople watched her with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Some remembered her from childhood. Visits a quiet girl with dark hair who always seemed to be reading in corners. The farmhouse key felt cold and heavy in Janet's palm as she stood on the front porch. 12 years of Kansas weather had taken their toll on the structure. Paint peeled from the siding in long, curling strips. Weeds had claimed the flower beds that Aunt Martha had once tended with such care. But the bones of the house remained solid, and Janet could see potential beneath the neglect. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon sunlight. The dining room table still bore those 5 place settings, now coated in a fine layer of grime. Janet ran her finger along the rim of a water glass, leaving a clean streak in the dust. Someone, the sheriff perhaps, or a well-meaning neighbour, had covered the furniture with white sheets that gave the rooms a ghostly quality. Janet moved through the house methodically, opening windows to let in fresh air, making mental notes of what needed repair. In the kitchen, she found a calendar still turned to October 1945. The 15th was circled in red ink with Harvest Dance, written in Aunt Martha's careful script. They had been planning for the future when they vanished. The cellar door lay hidden beneath a moth-eaten rug in the pantry, its existence unknown to the investigators who had searched the house 12 years earlier. Janet discovered it by accident while moving supplies, her foot catching on an irregular board that gave slightly under pressure. When she pulled back the rug, iron hinges gleamed dully in the dim light. The wooden steps creaked ominously as Janet descended, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The air below was thick and stale, carrying scents of damp earth, and something else, something that made her stomach clench with unease. Her light swept across stone walls that wept moisture, revealing a space larger than she had expected. Wooden crates lined the far wall, each one carefully labelled in Frank Peterson's precise handwriting. Winter clothes, 1944. Martha's china, children's school papers. Janet's breath caught as she realised what she was seeing. This wasn't just storage. This was a sanctuary, a place where the family had hidden their most precious belongings. In the corner stood a small desk, its surface covered with papers weighted down by a smooth river stone. Janet's flashlight illuminated pages of her uncle's handwriting, dense and urgent, but it was the object beside the papers that made her hands tremble. A pitchfork, its metal tines dark with stains that had never been cleaned. Behind the desk, a wooden shelf held personal items arranged with care. Martha's jewellery box, young Tommy's baseball glove, and Sarah's collection of pressed flowers. Each object seemed to tell a story of interrupted lives of a family who had tried to preserve what mattered most before what Janet's light found more disturbing evidence scattered across the floor. Torn fabric that might once have been part of a dress. A child's shoe, small and worn. And there, partially hidden beneath a pile of old newspapers, something that made Janet's blood run cold. A leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age and stained with what looked suspiciously like blood. She picked up the journal with shaking hands, knowing that whatever secrets lay within these pages would change everything she thought she knew about her family's disappearance. Frank Peterson's handwriting filled page after page, the ink growing darker and more urgent as the entries progressed. Janet sat cross-legged on the cellar floor, her flashlight balanced against a crate, and began to read her uncle's final thoughts. September 12, 1945. Bill Hendricks came by again today about the water rights. His tone was different this time, not just angry but threatening. He said we'd regret blocking his access to the creek. Martha heard him from the kitchen window, and she's been nervous ever since. September 20th. The salesman, Roy, was back today, more aggressive than before. Says we owe him $63 for the seed we bought last spring, but I paid that bill in full. Showed him my receipt, and he got red in the face, said the receipt was forged. Tommy heard him raising his voice and asked if everything was all right. Don't want the children frightened, but Roy's visits are becoming a problem. September 28th. Had to let Carl go today. Martha found him in Sarah's room this morning, said he was checking the window latch. But Sarah's window doesn't have a latch that needs checking. When I confronted him, he got that strange look in his eyes, the one that makes my skin crawl. Found some of Martha's jewellery missing from her dresser. Carl swears he didn't take it, but who else could it be? The entries continued, each one painting a picture of mounting pressure from 3 different men. But as Janet read on, a pattern began to emerge. While Frank's anger toward Bill Hendricks and Roy remained consistent, his mentions of Carl grew more complicated, tinged with confusion rather than clear suspicion. October 3rd, Carl came back today, apologetic as always. Brought the missing jewellery, said he found it in the barn where it must have fallen. Offered to work for half wages until he could prove himself trustworthy again. Martha thinks we should give him another chance. He's always been good with the children, and harvest season is almost here. October 10th. Something's not right with Carl. Found him watching Sarah again this time, through the kitchen window, while she did her homework. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was worried about strangers lurking around the property. But we both know there were no strangers. The final entry was dated October 14th, just one day before the family vanished. Janet closed the journal and climbed from the cellar, her mind racing with the implications of what she had read. The next morning she drove into town to speak with anyone who might remember Bill Hendricks and the bitter dispute that had consumed him in 1945. She found him at Millbrook's only diner, sitting alone in a corner booth with a cup of coffee gone cold. 12 years had not been kind to Bill Hendricks. His face was deeply lined, his hair completely grey, and his hand shook slightly as he lifted his cup. When Janet introduced herself, his eyes widened with something that looked like fear. "I figured someone would come asking questions eventually," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Been waiting for it, truth be told." Bill's story poured out like water from a broken dam. The water rights dispute had indeed been bitter, but it was born of desperation rather than greed. His own farm had been failing, his crops dying without adequate irrigation. The creek that ran between his property and the Petersons had been his lifeline, and when Frank had built a fence that blocked his access, Bill had seen his future disappearing. "I said some things I shouldn't have," Bill admitted, staring into his coffee. "Made threats I did not mean, but I never would have hurt Frank or his family. Never." His voice cracked on the last word. "When they disappeared, I thought maybe someone took my threats seriously and did something terrible. I've carried that guilt for 12 years. The sheriff had questioned Bill extensively in 1945. His alibi for the night of October 14th was solid. He had been at his brother's house in the next county, helping with a barn raising. 37 witnesses could confirm his presence there from dawn until well past midnight. "I knew Frank was having trouble with other folks too," Bill continued. "That travelling salesman had been coming around, getting more aggressive each time. And there was something off about their hired hand. Carl, I think his name was. Quiet fellow, but there was something in his eyes that made me uncomfortable." Janet left the diner with more questions than answers, but one thing had become clear. Bill Hendricks, despite his threats, was not their man. The trail to Roy, the travelling salesman, proved more difficult to follow. Janet spent 3 days making telephone calls to various towns across Kansas, trying to trace a man whose last name she didn't even know. Finally, the clerk at the general store in Hayes remembered a salesman who had worked the territory in the mid-40s. "Roy Mackenzie," the clerk said, consulting an old ledger book. "Seed and farming supplies. Had a temper on him, that one, always arguing about payments and such." Janet found Roy in a veterans hospital outside Topeka. His legs lost to a farming accident in 1951. The years had carved deep lines around his eyes, and his once powerful hands were now soft and pale from years of confinement to a wheelchair. When she mentioned the Peterson family, his face darkened. "Frank Peterson was a stubborn man," Roy said, his voice carrying the weight of old anger. "Accused me of cheating him, of trying to collect on bills that were already paid. Made me out to be some kind of crook in front of his whole family." Roy's version of events painted Frank as the aggressor in their dispute. According to the salesman, Frank had ordered a large shipment of hybrid seed corn in the spring of 1945, promising to pay after harvest. But when Roy returned to collect in the fall, Frank had produced a receipt that Roy claimed was falsified. "I got heated about it, I'll admit," Roy said, "but I was trying to make a living same as anyone. Frank Peterson cost me customers with his accusations. Word gets around in small towns, people started thinking maybe I was dishonest." Roy's alibi for October 14th was less solid than Bill Hendricks, but it existed. He had been in Garden City that week, staying at a boarding house while working the territory there. The boarding house owner had died years ago, but Roy still had the receipts tucked away in an old cigar box beside his hospital bed. "I was angry at Frank Peterson," Roy admitted as Janet prepared to leave. "Angry enough to want to see him fail. But I wouldn't have hurt his family. What kind of man do you think I am?" As Janet drove away from the hospital, she couldn't shake the feeling that Roy, like Bill, was telling the truth. With 2 of the 3 suspects eliminated, Janet found herself thinking more about Carl, the quiet farmhand who had seemed the least threatening of the 3 men mentioned in her uncle's journal. Unlike Bill and Roy, Carl had simply vanished after the Peterson family disappeared, leaving no forwarding address and no trace of where he might have gone. The pastor of Millbrook's Methodist Church, Reverend Hayes, remembered Carl well. "Quiet young man, maybe 25 or so," the elderly minister said as they sat in his study. "Came to services every Sunday, always sat in the back pew. Very devout, or seemed to be. Never caused any trouble." Reverend Hayes described Carl as soft-spoken and helpful, the kind of man who would stay after church to stack hymnals or sweep the vestibule without being asked. He had worked for the Petersons for nearly 2 years, living in the small room above their barn and earning a reputation as a reliable, if unremarkable, farmhand. "He was especially good with children," the pastor continued. "Always had time to help young Sarah Peterson with her Sunday school lessons. Very patient with her, very gentle." The Reverend paused, a slight frown crossing his weathered features. "Though I did notice he seemed particularly attentive to my daughter Rebecca during church services." Rebecca Hayes had been 16 in 1945, a pretty girl with golden hair and the kind of innocent face that belonged on a church calendar. The pastor's frown deepened as he spoke about her. Rebecca mentioned once that Carl had given her little gifts, wildflowers, a smooth stone from the creek. Nothing inappropriate, mind you. But looking back, I wonder if perhaps his attention was unwelcome. Janet pressed for more details, but the Reverend seemed reluctant to speak ill of someone who might be innocent. Carl had never done anything overtly wrong, never crossed any clear boundaries. He had simply been there, watching, helping, blending into the background of their small community like wallpaper. After the Petersons disappeared, Carl just left, Reverend Hayes said. One day he was there, the next he was gone. No one knew where. The most unremarkable suspect had become the most mysterious. Back in the cellar, Janet searched more carefully through the remaining items, her newfound suspicions about Carl driving her to examine every detail. It was wedged behind the jewelry box, almost invisible in the shadows, that she found it a small silver locket, tarnished with age and partially hidden beneath a stack of Martha's letters. The locket's chain was broken, as if it had been torn away in struggle. Janet's fingers trembled as she worked the tiny clasp, expecting to find a photograph of one of the Peterson children, or perhaps Martha herself. Instead, the face that looked back at her was unfamiliar. A young woman with soft features and golden hair, her expression serene and trusting. On the back of the photograph, written in faded pencil, were the words, "Rebecca H., God's Angel." Janet's breath caught in her throat. This was Rebecca Hayes, the pastor's daughter, the girl Carl had been particularly attentive to during church services. But why would her photograph be hidden in the Peterson family's secret cellar? And why was the locket's chain broken? She examined the locket more closely under her flashlight beam. The silver was of good quality, the kind of piece a young woman might receive for her 16th birthday or confirmation. But there were scratches on the surface that looked deliberate, as if someone had carved tiny symbols into the metal with a knife blade. The markings were too small and random to be decorative. They looked more like the obsessive scratchings of someone whose mind had begun to fracture. Janet returned to Frank's journal, reading through the entries again with new understanding. The references to Carl watching Sarah took on a more sinister meaning now. Her uncle had written about finding Carl in places he shouldn't be always, with innocent explanations that seemed reasonable at the time. Found Carl near the schoolhouse today, said he was looking for a lost cow. But our cows were all accounted for in the pasture. Martha mentioned that Sarah's bedroom window was unlatched again this morning. Third time this week. Need to speak with her about security. Carl offered to walk Sarah to and from school, says the roads aren't safe for young girls. Kind of him, but something in his tone made me uncomfortable. The pattern was becoming clearer, and it was far more disturbing than Janet had imagined. Armed with the locket and a growing understanding of Carl's true nature, Janet drove to the Hayes house to speak with Rebecca, now a woman of 28, with children of her own. Rebecca's face went pale when Janet showed her the photograph from the locket. "I gave that to him," Rebecca whispered, her hands shaking as she held the small silver piece. "He said he was going away, that he wanted something to remember me by. I was 16 and thought it was romantic." Her voice broke on the last word. "I had no idea what he was really like." Rebecca's story emerged slowly, painfully, like drawing poison from an infected wound. Carl had begun paying attention to her in the spring of 1945, appearing wherever she happened to be, walking home from school, helping at church socials, visiting friends in town. At first, his presence had seemed coincidental, even flattering. "He knew things about me that I had never told him," Rebecca said, staring at the locket. "My favourite hymn, the colour dress I had worn to church the previous Sunday, conversations I'd had with my friends. He said God had told him to watch over me, to protect me from the wickedness of the world." As the months passed, Carl's behaviour had grown more possessive and disturbing. He began leaving gifts on her windowsill, pressed flowers, carved wooden figurines, pages torn from religious texts, with certain passages underlined in red ink. When Rebecca tried to discourage his attention, he became agitated, speaking of signs and divine messages that supposedly proved they were meant to be together. "The last time I saw him was in early October," Rebecca continued. "He cornered me after church and said people were trying to keep us apart, that they were spreading lies about him. His eyes, there was something wrong with his eyes. They were too bright, too intense. He grabbed my wrist and wouldn't let go until my father appeared." Rebecca's father had confronted Carl the next day, warning him to stay away from his daughter. Carl had seemed to accept the warning, apologising profusely and promising to respect the family's wishes. But Rebecca now realised that Frank Peterson must have witnessed this confrontation, must have understood what kind of man he had been employing. The Petersons had discovered Carl's obsession, and they had threatened to expose him. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place as Janet returned to Frank's journal one more time, reading the last entry with horrifying clarity. October 14th, 1945, the night before the family vanished forever. Carl came to the house tonight after supper, said he wanted to explain about Rebecca Hayes, about the misunderstanding with her father. But there was no misunderstanding. I've seen the gifts he left for her, the way he watches her during church. Martha found sketches hidden in his room above the barn, dozens of them, all of Rebecca in various poses. Some of the drawings showed her sleeping. I told him he had until morning to pack his things and leave our property. Threatened to tell the sheriff about his behaviour if he ever came near our family again. The look in his eyes when I said that. I've seen that look before, in the eyes of a rabid dog we had to put down when I was a boy. Martha wants to pack the children up and go to her sister's house in Topeka until Carl is gone. She says she doesn't feel safe with him still on the property. I told her we'd leave in the morning right after I make sure he's cleared out. We'll never get the chance to leave. Janet could picture it now. Carl in the barn that night, knowing his secret was about to be exposed, understanding that his careful facade was crumbling. The Peterson family had been the only witnesses to his true nature, the only people who could destroy the reputation he had built in the small community. In his twisted mind, eliminating them had probably seemed like divine providence, a sign that God wanted him to be free to pursue Rebecca Hayes without interference. The pitchfork in the cellar told its own story, a weapon of opportunity grabbed from the barn where Carl lived, used in a moment of desperate rage. But Carl had been methodical too. He had hidden the bodies so well that they were never found, had cleaned up most of the evidence, and had vanished before anyone realized what had happened. Only the secret cellar remained with its cache of hidden belongings and the broken locket that revealed his true motivation. The quiet, helpful farmhand had been a predator hiding in plain sight, and 5 innocent people had died because they had tried to protect a 16-year-old girl from his obsession. Janet's hands shook as she closed her uncle's journal for the final time. The truth was more horrifying than she had ever imagined, but it was truth nonetheless. Carl hadn't just been a hired hand with a secret obsession. He had been a calculating killer who had eliminated an entire family to protect his twisted fantasy about Rebecca Hayes. The evidence was circumstantial but overwhelming. Carl's sudden disappearance immediately after the murders. His escalating obsession with Rebecca that Frank Peterson had discovered and threatened to expose. The locket hidden in the cellar torn from Rebecca's neck during what must have been his final attempt to claim her as his own. The sketches Frank had mentioned finding in Carl's room drawings that revealed the depth of his delusion. Janet realized now why the family's bodies had never been found. Carl had lived and worked on the farm for 2 years. He knew every inch of the property, every hidden gully and abandoned well. He would have known exactly where to dispose of 5 bodies so they would never be discovered. But the locket had been his mistake, his one moment of sentimentality that had ultimately betrayed him. He must have kept it after killing the Petersons, unable to destroy this tangible connection to his obsession. Perhaps in his final moments at the farm, as he prepared to flee forever, he had hidden it in the cellar along with the other evidence of his crimes. The broken chain told its own story. Rebecca must have struggled when he tried to take it from her, fought against him, even as he dragged her toward whatever fate he had planned. The scratches on the silver surface weren't random marks. They were the desperate scratchings of fingernails as she tried to break free. Janet's stomach churned as she imagined Rebecca's terror in those final moments, facing the man she had once trusted, realizing too late what he truly was. Had Carl intended to take her with him when he fled? Had the Peterson family's intervention saved her life by forcing him to abandon his plans? The quiet farmhand had fooled everyone with his gentle demeanor and religious devotion. But beneath the surface had lurked a predator whose obsession had turned deadly when threatened with exposure. 3 months later, Janet stood in the Peterson family cemetery as 5 new headstones were unveiled, each one bearing the name of a family member whose remains had finally been found. The search of the farm property, guided by her discoveries, had located the bodies in an abandoned well on the far edge of the land, exactly where Carl would have known they would never be disturbed. The investigation that followed had confirmed Janet's worst fears. Carl's real name was Carl Emmett Dunn, and he had a history of obsessive behavior toward young women that stretched back to his teenage years. After fleeing Kansas, he had drifted through 3 other states, leaving a trail of frightened families and unexplained disappearances that authorities were now re-examining with fresh eyes. Rebecca Hayes stood beside Janet at the graveside service, her own children close at her side. The years had been kind to her. She had married a good man, raised a family, and found peace in a life that Carl had tried to steal from her. But the knowledge of how close she had come to sharing the Peterson family's fate would stay with her forever. "I think about it sometimes," Rebecca said softly as the pastor finished his prayer. "What would have happened if your uncle hadn't discovered the truth about Carl? Would I have simply vanished one night like they did?" Janet squeezed her hand. "But you didn't vanish," You lived and you built something beautiful with your life. That's what matters now. As the mourners began to disperse, Janet looked at the farmhouse one last time. She had decided to sell the property to let another family build new memories where so much tragedy had occurred. The real journey was just beginning, the healing that comes from finally knowing the truth, no matter how painful that truth might be. In the end, that was the lesson evil might hide behind familiar faces and gentle smiles, but love and courage endure, even in the darkest places. As they moved toward their cars, Janet squeezed Rebecca's hand. "It's finally over," Janet whispered. "We can both move forward now." They stepped toward healing, toward a future they would build one day at a time.
Thank you for listening to Brody's Stories. Until we meet again.